Hi everybody, I'm Toby Capwell. I'm curator of Arms and Armour here at the Wallace Collection, and I'm also one of the co-curators for our new exhibition, Henry Moore, The Helmet Heads. This exhibition has been getting going for about 20 years, but we finally managed to pull it off. This is a live streaming tour of the exhibition. The museum doesn't actually open for another hour or so I thought this was a good time to have a run through and show you some of the highlights and talk about some of the key ideas that we're trying to work with in this show. This is actually the first major exhibition of armor the Wallace Collection has ever had, despite the fact that nearly half of the total contents of this museum are weapons and armor. Especially from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So this is a great opportunity for us to start really exploring this part of the collection and asking some fundamental questions like, what are weapons and armor doing in an art museum? That's something that a lot of people might wonder, and actually a lot of people don't go and see the Arms and Armour collection in the museum. They've come to see art, so they immediately go upstairs to look at paintings and sculpture and so forth. But the Arms and Armour seems a bit more strange or alien or unapproachable. So with this show, I really want to start attacking the idea of, or not attacking rather, but exploring the idea of armor as art and attacking rather the misconceptions that surround it. And the way we can do it in this case is by looking at the career of the artist Henry Moore, one of the most famous artists of the 20th century. He's a pretty famous artist, but very few people know that he was interested in armor. He was profoundly inspired by it, and whenever he had armor on the brain, he came to the Wallace Collection. This was his armor place. He went to the early gallery and he looked at 15th and early 16th century armor and was hugely inspired by it. And this exhibition is the story of that interest and the work that he produced around it. So come on along with me and we'll look at some stuff. This is kind of this central introductory juxtaposition that is designed to really sum up everything that the show is about. You have on the one hand an original mid-15th century Italian helmet, and on the other the first of a number of sculptures that Henry Moore produced on the theme of the helmet, or what would later become known as helmet head. It's interesting to note, just to begin with, that we look at something like a helmet as a tool, a protective device, a piece of equipment used for fighting. And those utilitarian qualities often prevent the modern mind from really approaching the idea that what we are dealing with here is also a sculptural work of art. But, consider this helmet, that it has an extraordinarily refined shape. There's a lot of work that's gone into this that has nothing to do with function, has nothing to do with stopping people from bashing your head in, and everything to do with looking graceful, elegant, and magnificent. And it's interesting to me that Moore, from the very first time he came here in the early 1920s, he seems to have just got this implicitly. He wasn't put off or distracted by the utilitarian aspects of armor. He just instinctively knew that what he was dealing with was a sculptural art form of great power and one that he really wanted to interact with. So from the 1930s, he, at least, and probably before, he was bringing sketchbooks into the Wallace and not drawing detailed studies of the real things, but rather starting to graphically explore the ideas that objects like this stimulated in him. So let's carry on. So the 1930s is a really important period for more exploring not just armor, but all of the key themes and ideas that would later define him as a great artist. This is the time when he was not just coming to the Wallace Collection, he was also going to the British Museum, the Science Museum, the V&A, and he was hoovering up very diverse inspirations from the whole history of art at the same time as he was trying to create something new. He was a modernist, and he was deeply involved with the past, unlike a lot of other modernists actually, but at the same time wanting to really create some new ideas. And fundamental to that was the idea that pure abstract shapes and forms can stimulate powerful intellectual, emotional, and spiritual responses in the observers. You know, the idea that human beings are kind of hardwired to respond to form, kind of like how we respond to color in different ways for different reasons. So Moore wanted to find out what was going on with that and how he could use it in his work. And in the 1930s, you start seeing him creating vaguely helmet-like sculptures. And he's also playing around with different finishes and different materials that he feels can elicit different responses. This is a really interesting form idea that also develops in the 1930s, the internal-external form. At this stage, and in this example, you have this very organic-like outer shell, and then inside is a delicate, gracile second sculpture. And this work is all about the relationship between a vulnerable interior, often very biological, plant-like, what he called biomorphic, and the relationship between that inner form and a protective outer shell, either organic or artificial. And one of the other great joys of this exhibition was to be able to bring things together of quite contrasting scales. So from that very small upright form, we go to this huge one. This is the biggest sculpture I could fit in the gallery. There are many bigger ones, of course. Moore is famous for building really monumental bronze sculptures for external display. And obviously there's a limit to what you can put inside. But this is still pretty impressive. This upright internal-external form was always in Moore's own possession. He never sold it, or he didn't make it for anyone else. It was always in his studio for many years, just sitting there and continuing to inspire him. And as well as that kind of biomorphic internal-external thing, almost like maybe a womb protecting an unborn child, this is also clearly related to his studies of armor. The connections with armor, once you're dealing with these kinds of things, are not hard to see. And this introduces another key principle, which I think is fascinating in Moore's take on armor, but which is not really at all obvious or self-evident. You know, for Moore, there was always a deeply feminine aspect to armor. He's fascinated by the female protective force. What is a mother but a protector? The armor for her child, the enfolding outer form, caring for the child. And of course, that kind of imagery is not unique to Moore. It goes way back in Christian art, for example, and a whole lot further back than that. So we're dealing with some pretty ancient primal themes here. And that really, again, shows how he's got one foot in the ancient past and one firmly in the modernist present. So he was working with all of these ideas at the same time. And he's developed the really famous themes that he's known for internationally by the 1930s. The internal, external form, the reclining figure, and the mother and child. But what I was really anxious to show here in this exhibition is that the helmet, the armor theme, is integral to all of those other more famous areas of work. It's the lost fourth theme of Moore that really deserves more attention. And his concept of the helmet sculpture, or what he would later call the helmet head, was really fully formed after multiple visits to the Wallace Collection, after, as he said himself, the many hours he spent in the Wallace studying and looking at armor. By the eve of the Second World War, this idea had fully fledged in his mind, and it's represented by two key drawings of his, of which this is the most important. I'm really, really proud of the fact that, as well as co-curating this exhibition with the Henry Moore Foundation, the majority of Moore works come from the foundation for this show. That we have no Henry Moores in the Wallace Collection, unfortunately. We have loans from museums all over the UK and abroad, and from private collections as well. And this is one of the great things about an exhibition, that you can bring all that material together, just for one moment to explore one idea. And this drawing from the British Museum, very kindly lent, is the key really to the whole story. Moore made this drawing in 1939, and these are his synthesizing ideas for the helmet head concept. And several of them still are very closely resembling the overall sculptural character of a number of identifiable helmets in the Wallace Collection. It's clear that that's where a lot of the inspiration was coming from. And this study right here is in fact precisely the form that he then converted into his first bronze sculpture on this theme in the same year. Moore was a fantastic draftsman, as well as a great sculptor in many different materials. And also another part of the show was to really show the drawings that so often get overlooked. Very much like Michelangelo, he, not surprisingly, he loved Michelangelo, but very much like Michelangelo, he draws like a sculptor. He's ever in pursuit of depth and shadow and the play of light on three-dimensional objects in his drawings, and it is endlessly fascinating. So an exhibition like this, for me, as an Arms and Armour curator, is also an opportunity to take famous and familiar objects from our permanent collection that have been on display in the galleries upstairs for over 100 years, almost unchanged in their circumstances really since 1908. I can take special objects and display them in a new way to show what happens to these apparently familiar things when you display them in a different way and you light them as best you can. This is the only complete head-to-foot armor in the show. There are 43 complete armors in the Wallace Collection, and this is the only one that Moore was apparently interested in. And I love that, because it's like a window onto his taste and his interests. Of the 43 armors in the collection, this is the only one that does not really have any significant surface decoration. There's a bit of inscription and acid etching, but it's subtle. It doesn't in any way affect the pure, smooth, sculptural forms of the work. This is the most purely sculptural, almost abstract armor in the collection. All the other ones have fluting and embossing and chasing and all kinds of surface decoration that I think Moore wasn't really interested in. He was deeply inspired in the 1930s, especially by Brancusi. And Brancusi was famous for rejecting ornamental style of 19th century sculpture. You know, he wanted to get rid of what he called the vines and the overgrowth and the moss. You know, everything that disguised and obscured the pure sculptural form. So this is, you know, I would pick this as the armor that Henry Moore would like, now that I know something about him, even if I didn't have any evidence that he was interested in it. But I do. There's a drawing that was last documented in about 1986. We still don't know its current location. Despite our best efforts to locate it, we found everything else that we needed for the exhibition except this one drawing. But we do have a photograph of it that we've reproduced for the show. And this is an enlargement of a drawing that Henry Moore almost certainly made in the Wallace Collection armory. This comes from a fairly small portable sketchbook. And what Moore's doing here is not trying to draw what he sees, but trying to draw what the armor is bringing into his imagination. What is his formal and emotional response to it? And it's interesting that he immediately reads it as female. You know, his interest in the mother and child, the female protective force and all that had prepared him to be sensitive to it in that way. This is obviously not a female armor. There are none in existence anywhere in the world as far as we know, although women very, very rarely wore armor. Joan of Arc is one of the very unusual exceptions. But he saw something in it that was graceful and feminine, and that's what he was interested in. And he saw this besigue, this circular reinforce for the right side. He saw that initially as a breast. And in a couple of the treatments of this initial idea, you see breasts represented. But then he moves away from that. It's almost like that kind of literal representation is too obvious for him. He wants to find a subtler way of bringing that across. And he draws several other ideas, and this one he marks with a star or an asterisk, showing that it was this one that really lit him up, and this is the one that he then intended to move on in a sculptural form. Now notice that he, as well as trying to record his thought process graphically for later reference, he also wrote inscriptions to himself, little notes that again are like keys to memory. And what does he write up here? Series of helmet heads. Now these are not helmet heads, in the sense that we've already seen, but in putting that inscription in, he's relating it to that body of work, and he's considering it all part of the same thing. And then he writes armor heads, female armor. There it is. I'm not making it up. He wrote it there in his own hand. Woman in armor, Wallace Collection. There, my friends, is the proof of everything that we are talking about. And that's why it's a bit maddening that this is, of course, the one drawing we couldn't find for the show. But it's out there still somewhere. And if you know where it is, please tell us. And then, of course, you've got the sculptures. The original plasticine, helmet, head, and shoulders, which was only recently rediscovered as fragments and reconstructed at the Henry Moore Foundation. And then the final bronze cast, kindly lent by the Tate. And there's you can still see that although this is a highly abstracted form now, it still retains key defining elements of the original armor. The pronounced asymmetry, the more enfolded, protected left side, the more open, mobile right side, the graceful neck transitioning into a round skull helmet form, the medial keel, the brow definition of the visor, the use of the articulations. It's all there. The armor, the 15th or 16th century armor as an artist, is constrained creatively and sculpturally by the fact that he still always needs to get a human body inside his sculpture, right? Form, the artistic and the functional exerting pressure and limitation on each other. But Moore doesn't need to get a person inside his sculpture. So he can keep going beyond where his 16th century forebears could go and move into the realm of the purely abstract sculptural form that yet still expresses the power of the original reference. It's really extraordinary. And it helps me as an arms and armor person really prove and advocate the idea that this is armor is a major Renaissance art form that engages with deep, fundamental human impulses. And this is, just one way you can do that. I'm sure you can do it in a lot of other ways. So, he had synthesized the key idea of the helmet head, the internal organic form protected by an artificial helmet-like shell. He got all of that by 1939. And then the Second World War happened, and he had to stop the work. He can't do large-scale bronze castings during a war. His assistants all have other things they need to do. Henry Moore himself was brought in as a war artist and had other work to do. It was just not the right time to keep going with this idea. But in 1950, it really came back into his mind in a big way, and he started rapidly creating a lot of new work on this theme. Moving forward with an idea he wanted to work with, a decade earlier. And again, reminding ourselves with a couple of the key Wallace Collection references in this story. Moore always loved Italian mid-15th century Renaissance helmets and armor. That purity of form and the gracefulness and the proportions. And, the beauty arising out of pure form without any other kind of decoration is exactly what he was all about. And when you move on to his first sculptural works, created working with some really extraordinary drawings created in 1948 to 50, he then starts to cast in lead. This is fascinating. He loved lead. First of all, it's easier to work. It melts at a lower temperature. You can cast it with nothing more than the equipment of an ordinary garden variety kitchen. I'm not sure what his wife thought of that, but he did apparently use kitchen pots and pans to melt lead at one stage. But he also said that he loved the dangerous quality of lead. That he said that there's this sense that if you licked it, you might die, right? So there's a kind of ominous threat, but it also has an extraordinary finish. The color and the texture of it is really, really nice. And you can see here how he created first a maquette set where he could explore what happens when you put different internal sculptures into a single outer form. He can mix and match them and play around with them. There were originally 5 of these and another helmet as well, but you drop one of these in lead and it's ruined, and he melt it down and make something else out of it. So once he'd gone through that part of the process, he creates the full life-sized version in lead. This is helmet head number 2, created in 1950, at the same time as he's working in lead with helmet head number 1, which again has a lot of the very distinctive recurving shapes that you see on Italian 15th century helmets. But here he's also added the air ventilation cylinders from a 1916 pattern German Stahlhelm, the German infantry helmet of the First World War. Moore, of course, fought in the First World War at the Battle of Cambrai as a machine gunner. So he's also an armor user, and he experienced how armor worn for functional purposes can also take on expressive power. And indeed, both the German and British helmets of the First World War are absolutely iconic for the whole age, really. So Moore is aware of that and working with that as well. Finally, in the end, between 1950 and 1983, Moore created 7 numbered helmet heads, as well as all of the other armor and helmet-related work that we look at in the show. And because they are spread over a long period of the whole second half of Moore's career after the Second World War, they've never been displayed together. We have never seen helmet heads number 1 through 7 in their final bronze form in one room together before. Henry Moore himself never saw them together. His family has never seen them together. This is one of the achievements in this exhibition that I'm most proud of. And here they are. It's an extraordinary parade through his whole career, and we can follow his later life as an artist from 1950 through the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s. And as you follow them through time, the helmet heads start off with a very close formal relationship to the Wallace Collection helmets that inspired them. But you can see here, for example, in helmet head number 4, 1963, it's not looking so much like a helmet anymore. In fact, this is a kind of inversion of the idea. Instead of an artificial shell protecting an organic interior, you have quite an angular, artificial-looking interior with this extraordinary biomorphic, fleshy outer form. With helmet head number 5, though, he went back to the core, Italian formal idea before moving off in a completely different direction by 1975 with helmet head number 6, which is still called a helmet head, but it's now blending and morphing into another of his ideas, the so-called figure in a shelter. Ultimately, Moore would create 2 figures in shelters on a massive scale, over 6 meters high. One of them is now the monument, Spanish Civil War monument at Guernica in Spain, reminding us of early connections between Moore and Picasso, actually. Moore visited Picasso while he was still painting his famous Guernica. This sculpture reminds us of another quality of Moore's work, that he was also very anxious that you kind of explore it observationally and in your mind. And when he creates the really physically large versions of these ideas, you can actually physically explore them. They're as big as houses, almost. So that, this is again an interesting demonstration of how the work occurs on radically different scales as well, and gets sized up and sized down. And then the final helmet head number 7, is really small. It's the size of a maquette. It's almost smaller than some of the maquettes he created with this idea. But it's not. This is the final helmet head. It was never produced in any sort of larger scale. And ultimately my feeling is that when you look at all of these, the early ones, the more armored ones, have an ominous, almost threatening aspect to them. Armor is meant to be like that on some level. And they're created at a time when the Second World War was over, but now we were seeing the Iron Curtain coming down, troops getting sent to Korea. We can see war in Southeast Asia starting to escalate. And that's the environment that the first helmet heads are created in. It's tense, it's scary, it's ominous. But by the time you get to the end of the story, and really the end of Moore's life, there's a renewed kind of positive inspirational aspect as well. You know, when you Mary Moore, his daughter told me that she thought this looked very much like an apple opened up so that you can see the interior. That it's an image of regeneration and rebirth. And you know, that's what Moore always wanted. You know, he's very clear that he wanted people to be able to look at his work in different ways, respond to it for their own reasons, and make of it what they will. He never wanted to be too prescriptive about what it was supposed to be about. So I hope all of you, if you can, will come to the exhibition and look at it for yourself and make your own minds up. That's me, Toby Capwell. Thanks for joining us.